Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to the Civics in a Year podcast. You might have heard this name said in a couple of episodes, Alexis de Tocqueville, and you might have heard of democracy in America. And the more and more episodes we do, the more I was like, we really need to focus and see who this person is and what democracy in America is. So Dr. Bienberg is with us today. Dr. Bienberg, I know we're going to talk about, some of Tocqueville's thoughts, but can I ask the question first? Who is Alexis de Tocqueville and what is democracy in America?
Alexis de Tocqueville is a sort of French aristocrat in the 1830s who is trying to understand what he sees as the worldwide movement toward democracy and away from monarchy and aristocracy. I mean, there are even places that are having monarchy still, it's increasingly a constitutional monarchy, right? So effectively, we're moving away from the age of just the king issued a diktat, the aristocracy sort of helping with that. So he's trying to understand this. And he's particularly trying to understand this because, again, remember, France has been having multiple revolutions, right, between the 1780s, 90s, and then, again, in the 1830s. And so the sort of the most glib version that I can say is Tocqueville wants to understand why the American Revolution turned out to be such a success, why the American constitutional and democratic project seems like it's working, again, not perfectly. And he has some quite bracing critiques of things in America in the book. But basically, he says America seems like it's doing it right. And by contrast, the French Revolution was a disaster. The glib version that I like to say is Tocqueville wants to know why America is making constitutional democracy work after its revolution and why the French Revolution ended in the guillotining of Grandpa, which literally his grandfather was guillotined during the French Revolution, right? And so he's wanting to understand mostly actually so that he can help his fellow Frenchmen figure out how do we do this right. Now, Tocqueville very much has the attitude you can't just basically copy-paste constitutional institutions. He's very much influenced by Montesquieu in that regard, another name that we hear a lot. Mm-hmm. So he recognizes you can't just sort of plug and play that. And so he's very interested not only in the institutions, but even more so in the sort of ideas and features and habits that make democracy work. And just as a general rule, kind of previewing his thought, he tends to have the attitude that democracies tend to want to make things very clean and simple and absolute, and that they basically elevate simplicity and equality over the long haul. And so again, you're looking at the French Revolution, which is, well, we have to all be equal. So eventually that means we're going to start guillotining everyone who's above us in equality. We want the system to be clean. We want to start from now. We don't respect history anymore. So we're going to literally restart the calendar, right? So it's very much this effort to understand what are the things, and here's where he gets really impressed by the Americans, because he recognizes that the Americans make democracy work by checking democracy. And so he's fine, and this is, again, very much a Madisonian sensibility, right? This doesn't mean we want to create an aristocracy, but it does mean we want to have places, institutions, and sort of values and cultural features that say, maybe we don't want to just say, Vox populi, vox Dei, give the people what they want. The voice of the people is the voice of God immediately in all things. And so really that's what democracy in America is about. I also like to glibly say, Tocqueville is one, the people, is an academic in one way. He figures out how he can sleazily scare up grant money. And so he convinces the French government, him and his friend Beaumont, they want to go study prisons in America. I don't know if have you ever been to the Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania? I think that's a podcast.
Dr. Bienberg, we have a podcast on that because Curry Sotner, the president and CEO, is a very good friend of myself and of the center. So yes, we do have a podcast on that.
I remembered that as soon as I was saying it. It's fascinating. It really is an amazing, it's by far actually more interesting to me even than a con law guy than Independence Hall and all that. Obviously, I care about that more, but just as a historical place
it's still cool.
Yes. So fascinating. So yeah, best thing to go visit in Philadelphia. But anyway, so as they talk about in that podcast, you guys talk about, it was experimenting with sort of new models of prison theory. And so Tocqueville convinces the French government, let me go study that. But really, it's because he wants to get the French government to subsidize him running around in America, learning about democracy. And so that's what he does. So his most famous work is Democracy in America. I do have the heretical take that his sort of sequel he writes later, he dies before he finishes it, on the French Revolution, is in some sense even better. But Democracy in America is certainly his most famous and influential book. But fundamentally, it's trying to answer, what are the Americans doing right to make constitutional democracy work all these decades later? Whereas the French couldn't even manage for like 3 years without killing Grandpa.
It's interesting, like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, just the comparison and the kind of back and forth is very interesting. So in this book, Democracy.
Just as an aside to previewing another one we're going to do, in some sense, he also he's very similar to the political thought of Edmund Burke in this regard. Because Edmund Burke wants to say, why did the Glorious Revolution in England, why did that pan out in a really sensible way? And he's sympathetic to the American Revolution, and yet one of his books is one of the most famous political theory treatises, but it's effectively a critique of the French Revolution as it's happening. So Tocqueville and Burke both have this sort of, the Americans understand liberty properly, the French are crazy in the way that they're trying to do it. And so Tocqueville and Burke very much kind of pair together in that, but they're trying to understand the same things. What is it about limited government? Again, Burke is not a hyper-democrat, Tocqueville is not. But they recognize that a universe where the people basically control their fate is both just and the way that the world is working now. But how do we do it right instead of completely crazy? So sorry to cut you off there. I want to preview that.
No, you're totally fine. You're totally fine. So we're not going to talk about the entirety of Democracy in America today, because that is impossible, because we like to keep our podcast drivable and not hours and hours long. So today I want to ask more about Tocqueville's thoughts on federalism, localism, and the power of the town. Yeah. So what are his writings and his thoughts on those topics?
Yeah. So Tocqueville, let's save like the sort of constitutionally stuff for, I think, another one to avoid making it super long. So we'll focus on, like you're saying, this ideas more of kind of his theory and analysis of kind of the cultural stuff. But I do want to start with one quote from Tocqueville that I think sets this up. It's actually on our introduction class in Skedal. I insisted we put this on the syllabus. He says, when one examines the Constitution of the United States, one is frightened by the quantity of knowledge and discernment that it supposes in those whom it must rule. So it is to say, he that's right after he says that it is the most perfect of all known constitutions. So it's this constitution that is perfect, as he says, or the most perfect, but he also recognizes that it's actually scary if you think about how much knowledge and civic intelligence and participation he's assuming people will have. And that's why, at another point, he's so pleased and impressed. He says most politically active Americans can competently describe the different powers allocated to the federal government and to the state governments. Like, they can all pass basically a civics pop quiz if you gave them said, somebody says this is a Fed power, this is a state power, who gets it, right? He says they're not always going to get it right, but they can usually give you a pretty competent, argument for it. And that's why, just kind of a meta commentary here, that's why civic education is so important, and why what we're doing in both Skedal and in the Center for American Civics with this podcast is so important, because Tocqueville recognizes this is a really complicated, impressive, brilliant machine, the Constitution and the political architecture behind it. But it won't work if basically the civic knowledge and the cultural values that it assumes are gone. So just plug for the podcast, like why this kind of stuff is so important, because Tocqueville thinks that the system will die if you don't. And he starts by saying one of the things that he thinks makes that work, makes people able to do that, is that they're used to participating in politics because of their local town governments, particularly. He's very smitten when he's traveling. He's very smitten with the New England town government, where they all come together at times and like everybody piles into the local church and they all talk about, what's the issue that we're dealing with this time? Like, and they see a problem. How do we fix it? And so he says they get used to participating, to give and take, to understanding trade. Like they get used to just basically the art of governing. They get used to losing. They get used to basically all the things you need to do to make sort of self-government work. And he credits this both to the sort of decentralized structure. He credits a lot of this. I assume this will be sort of another podcast, to the sort of early attitudes that come from the New England Puritans that sort of get attached to this idea that we're participating in government. So he really thinks that this gives you the practice, it gives you the confidence, it gives you the skills, that you don't just say like, government's complicated, I throw up my hands, somebody else smarter than me figure it out, which will sort of, I'll come back to. That's his end game of what he thinks democracy gone wrong will look like, is you just basically say, I give up. Let the smart people figure it out for me. The Constitution is too complicated, politics is too complicated, I just don't care. So he really thinks that the American system of local government and participating in politics is important. And that's part of why, that's part of why he likes federalism too, because federalism also gives you, localism, local government means, both local government, strictly speaking, and state government. It gives you basically more ways to participate and actually make a difference, versus, as I tell my students, you can't get that much through Congress. Most of what you're going to do is a circular file, but you can go to a school board, you can talk to your state legislator, like you can actually make a difference in that way. And so that's one of the things that he thinks is a check to keep democracy from going off the rails. That in America, you have all these actual meaningful opportunities to participate. And so just kind of in general, I guess it's probably the best time to talk about this, but he really thinks democracy works by building in these features like local government that check democracy's worst excesses. So federalism and political decentralization, it gives you sort of a legal structural check. He notes, again, I think this is what we'll talk about in another one, America has at the time a very intense religious piety that people say actually God is omniscient and omnipotent. And so people are imperfect and maybe our politics should be humble about what we're trying to think we can solve. This is one of the contrasts he makes with the French, that the French say, reason means that we know exactly what we're doing. We can figure all the problems out. He appreciates that the courts enforce the Constitution and the rule of law against majority wins. And then I know you guys have been talking about political parties and other ones, but political parties are basically a way that people can come together and say, those idiots are wrong, even though they won. So local government is one of the most important of these for him. It's just basically, it's a check. It's a check, and it's one that keeps people sort of invested. So federalism for Tocqueville, the main advantage for him is not that it leads to either better policy or to diverse outcomes. Those are often defenses of federalism that people make. Hey, different societies can do things differently. He doesn't disagree with that. But for him, the most important thing that federalism does is it checks what's either for him the most dangerous or second most dangerous outcome of a democracy, which is basically this idea of consolidated power, right? Tocqueville says that a democracy that's properly balanced will protect both liberty and equality. But he worries that under democracy, you tend to elevate equality by making it about equality of outcomes instead of political and legal equality. In the Declaration of Independence, like all men are created equal means political and legal equality. And he says, once a society does that, liberty will be easy to give away. And so democracies will tilt, he says, toward uniformity. They'll want to make everything equal. And he says the things that look unequal will make people go into a frenzy. And so he says localism and federalism sort of get people conditioned to just think like stuff that's different is okay, right? That's an okay thing for our society. And in fact, he says in one line in Democracy in America, he says, without this decentralized federalism, without these ideas that like power should be dispersed and that things can be different, he says American democracy would be the most oppressive society in the entire world. Which is a really like bracing prediction. That democracy, by its nature, tends to be bitterly oppressive, and so you have to be very careful in attending to these checks like local government and federalism, even though it's hard, even though federalism can be complicated. And so again, he says federalism basically helps this in two ways. It gives you more places to participate. You can work in your state government. You can work in your local government. And so it checks, and this is one that I know Zach German wants to talk about in another podcast, the atomization, the sort of resignation, giving up. And so, as he says, for example, he fears that the end game of democracy will be a society that creates a soft despotism, and he calls it a tutelary power. He says it'll basically be like a school teacher. It's not going to be scaring you with guns. It just means you're basically going to sort of give up. And so he says that eventually the outcome is that democracy will take each individual by turns in its powerful hands and kneads them as it likes. It will cover its surface with a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules through which original minds and most vigorous souls cannot clear a way to surpass the crowd. It does not break wills, it softens them, bends them, and directs them. So you're not scared of this democracy. You just sort of give up and basically wait for instructions from above. And he says that this can be coupled with external freedom, what seemingly looks like freedom, but you're just going to sort of throw in the towel. And so this is where he thinks democracy is federalism is useful, because it's a way to push back against this. It's a way to basically get people committed to political freedom. It's a way to get them to have sort of a sense of political humility, where they're going to say, actually, that central government far away can't figure it all out because we as a society can't figure it all. We can't figure it all out. So it's this really important check for him. And again, it's part of the thing that just gets people used to talking about, he calls them forms, but that means sort of legal technicalities. Because he says, in a democracy, people tend to get the attitude of, I want that thing, I'm going to get that thing. And so, lawyers, and we'll talk more about this in the second one, but lawyers are used to saying, no, you have to do it kind of by the rules. Well, federalism is a sort of a rule. Like, no, that goes to this part of the government, not to that part of the government. And so it helps Americans to think about decentralized power and just about thinking, instead of just like, Washington, fix my thing for me. Well, no, maybe actually it should be Phoenix, fix my thing for me. Or, and I guess I should say Phoenix state government or Phoenix city government, like fix my thing for me. And Tocqueville has, and I want you to note this thing, he has this really sad line. There's a lot that's like really kind of, plucky Americans, and there's a lot where he's really resigned, but he always has this section that I always make sure my students read it, where he says, look, I've tried to lay out in this book sort of what makes democracy go well. I'm basically writing this so that we can have a chance to make democracy work. And he says, and I'll just quote him here, forgive me for reading this long passage, but it's really moving, I think. He says, among our contemporaries, I see two contrary but equally fatal ideas. Some perceive inequality only anarchic tendencies to which it gives birth. They dread their free will, but they're afraid of it themselves. And then he says, others, fewer in number, have another view. They have finally discovered the path that seems to lead men invincibly towards servitude. They bend their souls in advance to this necessary disservitude. Despairing of remaining free at the bottom of their hearts, they already adore the master soon to come. He says, some people abandon freedom because they deem it dangerous, the others because they deem it impossible. And he says, if I had this latter belief, I would not have written the work you have read. I would have limited myself to groaning in secret about the destiny of those like me, right? And so he says, democracy, keeping an actual liberal constitutional democracy is hard. And some people are just going to say, you know what? It's too hard to do this. It's too hard to protect constitutionalism. It's too hard to protect liberty. Screw it. I'm just going to make my peace with this sort of overbearing nanny state, and I'm going to just check out and give up. And he says, in a sense, that's almost the rational play. But he says, that's not what a good society would look like. So I'm going to try to write this book so that you can hopefully read from it, so that we can all do the hard work together of preserving liberal free democracy against this sort of apathy and centralized state that is just going to do all of our thinking for us. So that's the sort of end game of democracy in America, of what the whole purpose of the book is.
Thank you for that. I'm going to be very honest. I've never read Democracy in America. I know of it and I know themes of it, and I do know the Eastern state penitentiary because we've had the podcast, but I know his name has come up a bunch. And so in our next episode with Dr. Weinberg, you had made a comment in one of the podcasts we did on Andrew Jackson and like Jacksonian Democrats about what Alexis de Tocqueville thought of Jackson. So that is going to be our next episode. Dr. Weinberg, thank you for setting us up for this kind of little series that we're doing. You know, we're going to have different scholars on to talk about democracy in America, to talk about Tocqueville. So thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.